Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. It was a humid Sunday evening, March 29th. The kind of night where the heavy air of Miami International Airport seems to settle into the very marrow of the travelers passing through its sprawling terminals. Most people were focused on the simple, rhythmic motions of travel, checking watches, adjusting neck pillows, and staring at the glowing departure boards that promised a way home. Among the bustle was Frontier Airlines Flight 1204, a late-night service bound for the cooler, historic streets of Philadelphia. For the passengers waiting at the gate, the goal was simple: board the plane, find their seats, and drift into a quiet slumber above the clouds. But as the clock neared 9:50 p.m., the atmosphere at the boarding gate began to shift from the mundane to the confrontational, setting the stage for a dispute that would soon go viral across the globe. In the world of modern air travel, there is a delicate, often strained balance between the rules of the carrier and the expectations of the passenger. We have all stood in those lines, feeling the weight of our bags and the slight anxiety of the boarding process. But for three women, Nafisa Dockery, Devana Cochran, and Dyanjana Cochran, a routine check of their carry-on luggage would become the catalyst for an impossible standoff. The dispute began over something as seemingly small as an extra bag, a detail that thousands of travelers navigate every day without incident. However, on this particular Sunday night, the refusal to pay a baggage fee would spiral into a series of choices that bypassed every security protocol designed to keep an airport functioning. It was a moment where common sense went out the window, replaced by a defiant resolve that would eventually require the intervention of the Miami-Dade Sheriff's Office. As you settle in tonight, perhaps listening to the distant hum of the world outside your own window, visualize the bright, sterile lights of the Miami terminal. Imagine the sounds of rolling suitcases on linoleum and the muffled announcements echoing through the halls. It is within this setting that our story unfolds. A story of how a minor disagreement over airline policy escalated into a full-scale aircraft evacuation and multiple arrests. The transition from a standard boarding process to a restricted area breach happened in a matter of seconds, leaving staff and fellow passengers in a state of stunned disbelief. It is the kind of situation that makes one wonder how a journey home can turn so abruptly into a journey toward a jail cell. The altercation started at the podium, where a Frontier employee was performing the final checks. The employee noted that while the trio had only paid for one carry-on bag, they were attempting to board with two. In the low-cost carrier model, these rules are the structural pillars of the business. Yet for the three women, the request to step out of line and pay the fee was met not with compliance, but with a verbal altercation. Witnesses would later describe the tension rising as the employee explained the necessity of the payment. The warning was clear: pay the fee or you will be removed from the flight. It was a crossroads moment, a point where the situation could have been de-escalated with a credit card swipe or a simple agreement to follow the protocol. Instead, Nafisa Dockery allegedly turned to her companions and uttered the words that would seal their fate for the evening. "We don't have to listen. Let's just go." What followed was a breach of airport security that sent ripples of alarm through the gate area. Despite being warned that law enforcement would be notified, the women chose to rush onto the aircraft. They didn't go through the standard boarding lane. Instead, they pushed through a door clearly marked as a restricted area, reserved only for authorized personnel. In an environment as highly regulated as an international airport, such an act is more than just a violation of airline policy. It is a challenge to the very systems of safety we rely on. By the time they reached the cabin of Flight 1204, the open loop of the dispute had become a legal crisis. They found their seats and sat down, perhaps believing that once they were on the plane, the rules of the terminal no longer applied. But the gears of the Miami-Dade Sheriff's Office were already in motion, and the quiet of the cabin was about to be broken. When the deputies arrived at the gate, the Frontier manager was there to explain the situation. The women's boarding passes had been officially revoked. They were no longer passengers, but trespassers on a multi-million-dollar piece of machinery. The deputies entered the plane, their presence a stark contrast to the sleepy travelers around them. They moved down the narrow aisle to the row where Nafisa, Davana, and Dionjana were seated. The request was simple and firm. They needed to leave the plane because their boarding passes were no longer valid. Yet, even in the face of badges and uniforms, the trio refused to comply. They ignored multiple warnings, staying anchored in their seats as the minutes ticked by, and the flight's departure time drifted further away. It was at this point that the situation reached a frustrating peak for everyone else on board. In order to carry out the arrests safely and according to protocol, the deputies made the decision that every traveler dreads, every single passenger on Flight 1204 had to deboard the plane. Imagine the collective sigh of 100 tired people, forced to gather their belongings and shuffle back into the terminal because of a dispute over a single bag. It was a moment of deep frustration for the community on the plane, a feeling that something so small should have been resolved long before it reached this point. And as the passengers stepped back out into the bright, silent terminal, the scene in the cabin was about to become even more physical. The struggle between the three women and the deputies was brief but intense. As the cuffs were produced, the women reportedly tensed their bodies and pulled their arms away, a final act of resistance in a series of choices that had defined the last hour. Nafisa Dockery allegedly spat on a Frontier employee, an act of contempt in the heat of the moment that would eventually lead to a battery charge. It was a chaotic in the humid, neon-lit corridors of Miami International Airport on a late Sunday night. The transition from a weekend getaway to a legal nightmare began with a simple dispute over a carry-on bag. The air inside Terminal F always carries a specific weight, a mixture of jet fuel, floor wax, and the palpable exhaustion of thousands of souls in transit. By 9:50 p.m. on Sunday, March 29th, the usual frantic energy of the day had begun to settle into a low, rhythmic hum. The flickering flight boards displayed a sea of amber and white text, marking the final departures of the night. Among them was Frontier Airlines Flight 1204, a direct run to Philadelphia. For most of the passengers lining up at Gate F9, the goal was simple: get home, get to sleep, and prepare for the coming work week. But for three women in that line, the night was about to take a turn that would ensure none of them reached their destination. The stakes of a routine flight were suddenly discarded in favor of a confrontation that would escalate with terrifying speed. What began as a disagreement over a few inches of luggage space and a standard airline fee would soon spiral into a full-scale aircraft evacuation, leaving an entire plane of bewildered travelers stranded on the tarmac while police sirens cut through the tropical night. We often think of airports as highly controlled environments, places where the rules are absolute and the authority of the staff is unquestioned. Yet on this particular Sunday, that sense of order vanished. Nafisa Dockery, Devana Cochran, and Deanjana Cochran found themselves at the center of a storm that would eventually lead to multiple felony-adjacent charges, including battery and resisting an officer. As we settle into the details of this night, one has to wonder about the internal logic that leads to such a moment. Why did a baggage fee, a common if frustrating part of modern travel, lead to a deliberate breach of a restricted area? What was the catalyst that transformed a verbal argument into a physical struggle that required the intervention of the Miami-Dade Sheriff's Office? To understand the gravity of the situation, one must visualize the scene at the gate. The tired families, the business travelers with their noise-canceling headphones, and the Frontier employees just trying to close out their shift. The open loops of this case are as haunting as they are confusing. We are forced to ask what caused an entire plane of passengers, already buckled into their seats and ready for takeoff, to be forced off the aircraft at 10 p.m. It wasn't a mechanical failure or a weather delay. It was the result of a human refusal to follow a single, repeated instruction. The rhythmic squeak of suitcase wheels against the linoleum floor usually signals progress. But for these three travelers, those wheels were rolling toward a restricted door that was clearly marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Imagine the sound of distant jet engines humming in the background, a low-frequency vibration that you feel in your chest more than you hear in your ears. Outside the thick terminal glass, a soft rainfall began to blur the runway lights into shimmering streaks of blue and gold. It was an atmosphere of quiet transition, the kind of moment where most people are lost in their own thoughts or scrolling through their phones. But at gate F9, the silence was being punctured by raised voices. The Frontier gate agent, tasked with enforcing the strict baggage policies of a budget carrier, pointed out a discrepancy that should have been a minor hurdle. The trio had paid for one carry-on bag, yet they stood there with two. In the high-pressure environment of a late-night boarding process, these small details are the gears that keep the machine moving. When those gears grind to a halt, the friction creates heat. The employee explained that they would need to step out of line, go to the counter, and pay for the additional luggage. It was a request made 1,000 times a day in airports across the globe. But on this night, in this humidity, the response was not compliance. It was defiance. "We don't have to listen. Let's just go," Nafisa Dockery reportedly said. It was a sentence that served as a point of no return. With those 8 words, the path toward a jail cell was paved. They didn't just walk away, they rushed. They pushed past the gate, ignoring the warnings that law enforcement would be notified, and headed for the jet bridge. They were entering a space where their boarding passes were no longer valid. effectively trespassing on federal-adjacent property under the eyes of heightened post-9/11 security protocols. As they moved toward the aircraft, the tension shifted from a customer service dispute to a security breach. The restricted area signs they passed were not suggestions, yet they were treated as such. By the time they reached the door of Flight 1204, the machinery of the law was already in motion. Behind them, the gate agent was on the radio. In front of them was a plane full of people who had no idea that their night was about to be derailed by a carry-on bag. The atmosphere on the plane was likely that of any late-night flight. Dim cabin lights, the rustle of safety manuals, and the muffled sounds of bags being shoved into overhead bins. Then, the deputies arrived. The presence of uniforms on an aircraft always brings a sudden, sharp silence. The passengers watched as the officers approached the three women, who were now seated, attempting to blend into the routine they had just shattered. When the deputies gave the order to leave, the refusal was immediate. It was a standoff at 30,000 feet, or it would have been if the plane had been allowed to leave the ground. Instead, the captain made the call that every traveler dreads. The entire aircraft had to be deboarded. One by one, row by row, innocent bystanders had to unbuckle, grab their belongings, and walk back up the jet bridge, because three individuals refused to comply with the law. The frustration in that cabin must have been palpable, a thick layer of resentment directed at the three women who sat stubbornly in their seats as the plane emptied around them. The struggle that followed was not just physical, it was a total collapse of the social contract. As the deputies moved in to perform the arrest, the women reportedly tensed their bodies, pulling away from the metal of the handcuffs. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was resisting an officer without violence, a charge that carries significant weight. And for Nafisa, the night would get darker still, as an alleged act of battery, spitting on an employee, added a layer of visceral disrespect to the legal charges. Tonight, as we look into the neon-lit shadows of Miami International Airport, we aren't just looking at a travel story. We are looking at the thin line between a mundane Sunday night and a life-altering legal catastrophe. We are looking at how a carry-on bag became the catalyst for a full-scale police intervention. Adjust your volume, settle into your seat, and let the rhythmic hum of the airport atmosphere carry you as we begin to unspool the events of Flight 1204. The transition from the hook of this night to the cold reality of the charges is a journey through a series of increasingly poor decisions. It is a story of how "let's just go" turned into "you're under arrest." As the soft rainfall continued to hit the terminal glass outside, the three women were being escorted not to Philadelphia, but to the Turner Guilford Night Correctional Center. The neon lights of Miami, usually a symbol of vacation and freedom, now framed the windows of a police cruiser. Why did they think they could ignore the rules that everyone else followed? Was it a momentary lapse in judgment, or a fundamental misunderstanding of the environment they were in? As we move forward, we will look at the viral footage that captured the moment the world saw the consequences of that baggage dispute. We will hear the shouts, the warnings, and the final click of the handcuffs. But for now, just listen to the rain and the distant fading sound of jet engines as we prepare to step into the gate area of F9, where the clock is ticking toward 9:50 p.m., and the nightmare is just beginning. The night air in Miami is never truly still. It carries the scent of salt and the vibration of a city that doesn't know how to sleep. Inside the terminal, the lights are too bright, the floors too polished, and the stakes of every interaction are heightened by the looming deadlines of departure times. This was the stage for the Cochrane sisters and Nafisa Dockery. They were travelers in a world of rules, attempting to navigate a system that prizes efficiency above all else. When that efficiency was challenged, the system bit back. In the chapters to come, we will deconstruct every minute of that hour-long delay. We will look at the legal definitions of trespassing in an airport and the specific moment a verbal altercation becomes a criminal act. We will explore the aftermath, the viral videos, the public outcry, and the long road through the Florida judicial system. But as you listen, keep that image in your mind. The empty terminal, the flickering flight board, and the simple carry-on bag that started it all. It is a reminder that in the quietest hours of the night, the smallest spark can start a fire that consumes everything. The passengers of Flight 1204 would eventually make it to Philadelphia, but they would do so with a story they never asked for. They would remember the night they were forced off a plane in Miami because of a baggage fee. They would remember the sight of the deputies and the sound of the struggle. And for Nafisa, Devana, and Dionjana, the memory would be even more permanent. A set of fingerprints, a mugshot, and a date with a judge. The transition was complete. The weekend getaway was over. The legal nightmare had arrived.